Welcome to the session. This session again we will be discussing the pramana perception. Perception or pratyaksha according to Nyaya are of two types, one is ordinary perception, another is extraordinary perception. Before that, to recapitulate what we have discussed so far, in short, first we have discussed what is pramana and what is prama. In pramana we said that Nyayakas believed that there are four pramanas, one is perception, inference, comparison and testimony, and these are the means through which any knowledge we get, the knowledge will be valid knowledge. In other words, the valid knowledge will be known as prama. Therefore, they say that prama karanam pramanam. It is the pramana which will be work as a means, for the end will be the prama or valid knowledge. And further we have discussed how perception really plays a role in case of other pramanas also. We said that perception as a pramana, as an independent pramana, it has its own standpoint. In addition to that, even in inference, in comparison, even verbal testimony, in all the cases you find perception as a kind of preceding pramana in relation to other pramanas. Therefore, they said perception is the chief pramana among other pramanas. Now, what we will be discussing today is how Nyayakas really treats perception as a valid pramana and what are their views on perceptual knowledge. Further, we will also discuss what are the types of perception they describe in the Nyaya Sutra. So, all these things today we will be discussing in detail. So, we will start with that Nyaya said there are two kinds of perception, one is ordinary perception and the second one is extraordinary perception. When I say that according to Nyaya there are ordinary perception and extraordinary perception, you must understand that what they mean by ordinary perception and what they mean by extraordinary perception. For them, perception does not limit to our only visual contact. They said that perception can be possible through other sense organs also. That means, if there is a sound, you can hear it and the object is presented before you, therefore, you can say that your knowledge is valid on the object where the sound produces. In this case, if you feel something and can have knowledge about that object, then also your knowledge will be valid, and this can be treated as a perceptual knowledge. For a blind man, if he or she touches to the ice and feel the coolness of ice, can also he or she has a perceptual knowledge towards that object. Therefore, they said that perception should not limit to our visual perception only. Perception will be extended to other sense organs equally also. And when they say that ordinary perception, what they mean is that we as a cognizer, we perceive some object, the object will be presented before us, and also when we cognize that object, all the features of that object we can cognize, that is called truthfulness, and as a result we have a decisible cognition to that object. If you remember, according to Nyayakas, they said that asamdigdha yathartha anubhava, there are three conditions to be satisfied for having a prama or a valid knowledge of an object. What are these? One is asamdigdha, the second one is yathartha, and the third one is anubhava. Anubhava means is a presentational in character, yathartha means is truthfulness, and asamdigdha means it is a decisible cognition. That means to what extent you are cognized to that object, your cognition should be a valid one. First, your decision towards an object should be clear because you are giving a name to that object in particular. Second, you are cognizing a particular object because of its various characteristics or attributes or qualities, and all the qualities should conform to that object even in the later period without any contradiction. The third one, they said that the object should also present before you, that is presentational in nature. If all these three conditions to be satisfied, any knowledge you accumulate or you gain or achieved through your sense contact to the object, the knowledge will be treated as or judged as a valid knowledge or prama. In this way we have to understand. That means our sense organs contact to that object and the knowledge we gain this knowledge will be known as valid knowledge, and this valid knowledge will gain through the means of ordinary perception. And here perception also extends to all the sense organs, including mind, because without mind no knowledge can be gained, no knowledge can be achieved, no knowledge can be attained. Further, they said that extraordinary perception. In case of extraordinary perception, what they said, we as a cognizer, our sense organs do not contact to that object directly, but there is a means, there is a media through which our sense organs contact to that object, and henceforth we have a knowledge about that object. In this way, where our sense organs contact to that object indirectly, this knowledge is known as valid knowledge, and this will be known through the extraordinary perception. If I give an example of sandalwood tree, you know that what is sandalwood tree, and you know the smell of sandalwood tree. If I say that this experience you have, and now you are walking down to a particular street and you find that some kind of smell related to sandalwood tree, but however you cannot see the object as a sandalwood tree due to your earlier experience or past experience, that how sandalwood tree and the smell of sandalwood tree both are related, interrelated, connected and inseparated with each other. Because of your this kind of previous experience, now you retrieve the knowledge and say that maybe nearby there are some sandalwood tree. So here your sense organs is not directly contact to that object sandalwood tree. It is through this quality, the smell, your sense organs contact to that object. Henceforth you accumulate the knowledge about that object, and in this way our sense organs indirectly contact to many of the objects. As a result, we gain the knowledge about that object. So now we will discuss what they mean by ordinary perception, and what are the kinds of ordinary perception, and what are the kinds of extraordinary perception. In a brief, I hope you have understood what is they mean by ordinary perception and what they mean by extraordinary perception. To repeat further, I say that if an object will be presented before the cognizer, and the cognizer is able to cognize that object with a particular name and able to distinguish that object from other objects, and also can relate to that object to others object. In addition to that, what are the characteristics through which a cognizer cognize an object should be conformity to that object, then in this case we find that our sense organs directly contact to that object, and it is nothing but our ordinary perception really involves for having the knowledge about that object. But in case of extraordinary perception, the object is not presented before the cognizer, however the cognizer sense organs indirectly contact to that object, and the knowledge that he or she gains about that object is also treated as a valid knowledge, and this is possible because of our extraordinary perception. Further, they said that ordinary perception are of three types. One is nirvikalpaka, that means indeterminate perception, and the second one is savikalpaka pratyaksa, that means a determinate perception, and the third one is pratyavijnana, that means recognition. You cognize an object which you have already cognized in the past, and further you are able to cognize that object because you retrieve all the information which you had experienced in the past in the same way and impose on that object, and henceforth you identify that object saying so and so name, and further said that you had experienced the same object in the past. This is called recognition. Now we will be discussing all these things in detail. Now if you see my slides, I said that the same thing, perception is of two types. One is ordinary perception, or in Sanskrit Nyaya said it is a Laukika perception. The second one is extraordinary perception, or it is known as Alaukika perception. In the case of Laukika or ordinary perception, there is a usual sense contact with object which is presented to the senses, which I have discussed with you now. Now second case, in case of extraordinary perception, there is unusual medium of sense contact. That means the sense contact is not directly finding to that object, or the object is not presented before the cognizer. Henceforth the cognizer not able to contact his or her sense organs to the object directly. What is saying that in case of alaukika perception, there is an unusual medium of sense contact with objects present to the senses. Now further they said that ordinary perception, when you talk about perception, perception not limited to our visual sense organs only. He said that the internal perception, manas, as well as the external perceptions, all the 5 sense organs can be included, and any knowledge we gain by the help of these are the sense organs will be also considered as ordinary perception. So therefore, for them ordinary perception is of 2 kinds, one is internal perception, another is external perception. So therefore, 6 kinds of sense organs contacting to the object in a usual way. When our sense organs contact to that object in a usual way, this is nothing but called as ordinary perception. It is through the ordinary perception we accumulate a knowledge of an object. We know an object with its details. Now I believe you can now understand what Nyaya mean by ordinary perception and how really they bring to the notion that 6 sense organs. Their discussions not limited to visual perception only. However, whenever they say that there is ordinary perception, you must understand that all our 6 sense organs involved in contacting to that object directly, and any knowledge we get, it is known as a valid knowledge, and this is possible through the ordinary perception. Now we will move towards the extraordinary perception. Now as I said that what is extraordinary perception, there is an unusual medium of sense contact. That means the object is not certainly presented before the cognizer, and henceforth the cognizer sense organs not able to contact to that object directly. Therefore they are saying that there are many knowledge that a cognizer has in his or her earthly life because of the indirect sense contact. Many times we say that fire looks hot because of our earlier experiences that fire and heat, they involve or they interact with each other, or they are inseparable with each other. As a result, whenever we see a fire, we see that there is a heat over there. Another example I can give, see, whenever we see an ice, we say that, oh, it is cool, because the coolness and the ice both are inseparably related with each other. The coolness inheres in that ice as an object. Henceforth, whenever we see a piece of ice without touching even that, we say that the ice is cool. In this way, we have indirect perceptions. Now we will see what they mean by ordinary perception and how they explain ordinary perception by dividing into 3 parts. As I said, it is a determinate, indeterminate, and pratyaksa. Ordinary perception for them is classified into 3 types based on the modes of perception. The first one is indeterminate perception, the second one is determinate perception, and third one is pratyaksa. All these 3 perception, I will give an example, I will explain it, then whatever I have written in the slides, I will go through it. Henceforth, all the concept about these 3 perception will be clarified to you in detail. Now first considering the indeterminate perception, what they mean. I am now giving an example. If you listen carefully, it will help you to understand. In the early morning, you started walking to go to a particular place. After reaching that particular place, you met your friend, and your friend asked a simple question: did you find so and so object on your way? Then you have to retrieve in your memory. You stand still for some time and now try to think. Now you are thinking that when you are coming, whether that object you have seen or not. Then whenever you try to retrieve all the information, still also you are not sure whether you have seen that object clearly or not. What you are responding to your friend's question is that this may be the case that I have seen it, but I am not sure about it. That means while you came down from your home to meet your friends to a particular place, you have seen many more things, but you have not seen a particular thing, you have not perceived a particular thing with its true nature. Whenever you perceive a thing, it does not satisfy the three conditions, that is asamdigdha, yathartha and anubhava. As a result, you could not able to explain to your friend and you could not able to sure about that object. Henceforth, this kind of perception is known as indeterminate perception. That means, though we are seeing many objects on our way, we could not identify each and every object that we have a glance through while walking in the street. He is saying that whenever you try to recapitulate all the objects that you have seen while coming the way from your home to meet me, you could not able to recapitulate, you could not able to retrieve through your memory, because your perception was not a correct one. You did not have a valid knowledge about all the objects that you have glanced through. So henceforth, you cannot even distinguish these are the objects from other objects. You cannot even say that what are the objects you have seen in its true nature, and cannot even also further say that these are the objects, whatever you have seen, it will have a similar feature with some of the other objects. These are found in this earth. In this way, they have explained indeterminate perception. We have a perceptual knowledge, but these perceptual knowledge are not very clear. It does not satisfy asamdigdha, yathartha, anubhava characteristics. As a result, our knowledge about that object is not valid. It is an indeterminate perception. Now further they said it is a determinate perception. Determinate perception means the object should be presented before the cognizer, and the cognizer is able to cognize a particular object having a particular name. Once you cognize a particular object having a particular name, that means you identify all the features of that object, and henceforth you know that you have given a name to that object. And this implies that you can make a distinction between that object, what you have cognized now, from other objects. Even you can make a similar opinion saying that this object has a features which is similar to some other objects, because in this case your perception is a valid one. It is a determinate perception. So here there are three factors involved. One is the object is presented before you, and the second one is truthfulness. That means all the features of that object you have identified, which is conformed to the object, and the third one, your decision to that object is very, very concrete, is very accurate, because you identify that object, you cognize that object with a particular name. So therefore this kind of perception will be turned into valid. The third one, they said that pratyaksa, that means recognition. Recognition will say recognition. I will give an example. For example, now you have seen there is a horse in front of you. You have seen horse in zoo some maybe 4 or 5 years back. Now what, after seeing that animal which is standing in front of you, now your memory retrieve all the information about the horse which you had seen few years back. Now you are bringing all the concepts in a horse what you have seen in the past and imposing on that particular object which is presented before you. If you find that there is a similarity, you simply say that this animal name is horse, or you identify the animal with a particular name, say horse, because your experiences in the past was a determinate perception. You had accumulated the knowledge concretely, accurately. Henceforth it was stored in your soul in the form of impression, and whenever in the later period you came across the same kind of object or the similar object, all the information that is stored in your soul in the form of impression retrieved through your memory and imposed on the particular object which is presented before you. Therefore they said that often pratyaksa or recognition is known as determinate perception. Until unless you do not have determinate perception, you cannot recapitulate all the information in a sequential way. And these are things Nyaya has discussed while distinguishing savikalpaka pratyaksa from nirvikalpaka pratyaksa. Further they said that in case of nirvikalpaka pratyaksa, you cannot make any kind of relation to others object. Here they said that whatever we have glanced through while walking in the street, or whatever we have perceived, that is not a true knowledge, that is not a valid knowledge. Henceforth it is not a valid knowledge. Whatever knowledge you gain just by walking through and having glance on that particular object or some of the objects, you cannot relate to that object to another object, because your friend whenever asks that whether or have you seen that particular object while coming on the way, you said that you have not seen, or if you can say that you are not sure about it. This is possible because your knowledge is not determinate, your knowledge is not valid, you do not have a concrete knowledge about that object. And this way they say that once you do not have a concrete knowledge about that object, you cannot relate to that object to any other object. So it cannot be a relational indeterminate perception. But in case of determinate perception, it is a relational. You can say that this object is similar to other object. You relate this object with other objects. You say that this object is a certain purpose because it relates to x, y and z. Further, in case of nirvikalpaka pratyakya, even it is not predicted, because whatever you will predict, this may not be correct. Therefore, your prediction is not a correct one, not a valid one. When our friend asks a particular object, since you are not have a concrete perception on that object, since you do not have a valid perception or a correct perception to that object, you cannot even predict that object even in future. Therefore, they say that in case of nirvikalpaka perception, whatever knowledge we gain, it is a conscious knowledge, but not self-conscious knowledge. If it is a self-conscious knowledge, then the knowledge that we will gain on a particular object will be known through determinate perception. Since it is just a consciousness, just to have a glance through a particular object and the knowledge we gain in a very brief way, which is not a concrete, henceforth it neither be relational nor can be predicted. Further, they said that in case of pratyabhigyana, it is relational, because you exactly retrieve all the information what you had experienced in the past, and also you can able to predict the situation or predict the object with its true nature. You can able to explain all the characteristics about that object even in a later period, because here you have a determinate perception. Now we will see how Nyayakas really put in their own words to explain the three perception which comes under the ordinary perception or Laukika perception. Now, in case of indeterminate perception, you find that they said it is a pure sensation without any determination of that object. That means whenever you come through from your home to meet your friends, while walking on the street, you have glanced through any of the object. This is your, because of your sensation, you have glanced through. But whenever your friend asks about a particular object, you cannot sure about that object, because that was not a determinate perception. You have not perceived an object with its determination. That means all your perception is not a valid one. You just have a sensation in case of an indeterminate perception. Further, they said that it is the knowledge of a thing as not related to anything, not even to itself. What they mean here is that whenever we had a knowledge in case of nirvikalpaka perception, it is not related to anything. That means whenever your friend asks that, have you seen that particular object? Since you are not sure about that object, you say that I may have seen that, but I am not able to explain how I have seen it. Therefore, they said it, the second point, it is the knowledge of a thing as not related to anything, not even to itself. If you have concretely identified that object, you could be able to recapitulate the information. Since you have not done that, therefore, your knowledge will be not treated as a valid knowledge. The third point, therefore, I said it is the knowledge of the identity of a thing as excluding all relations. I said that nirvikalpaka perception cannot be relational, because since our perception is not very concrete, authoritative and not even valid, therefore, we cannot relate to that knowledge to any other objects, or whatever knowledge we gain through nirvikalpaka perception. Since it is not a concrete knowledge, we cannot relate that knowledge to any other than knowledge which is supposed to be related to that object, or which is required to understand that object. So, in this way they have explained nirvikalpaka perception. Now, if you read this, it will be more clear to you. In this perception, in the perception means nirvikalpaka perception, there cannot be any prediction. As I said that we cannot predict any of the object, because we have not seen any kind of object, we have not perceived any object with its concrete nature. They said that in addition to that, the perception, there cannot be any predictions of the object in terms of the subject predicate or substantive adjective relation. That means, whenever you have a knowledge of through nirvikalpa perception, you cannot even make a distinction between subjective knowledge and objective knowledge. Whatever knowledge you gain through the nirvikalpa perception, you even cannot claim that your knowledge is a determinate knowledge. That means, just have a glance through it. You cannot make a distinction between the cognizer and the object itself. Further, they said that nirvikalpaka is not predicted, neither even it is relational. In this context, Advaita Vedanta said that it is a judgment of identity expressed in a proposition. The identity that is perceived in nirvikalpaka does not pertain to any of the specific attributes of or parts of the perceived object. What they mean is that I have already explained. Further, again explaining Advaita Vedanta standpoint on the nirvikalpaka perception. Advaita Vedantins very clearly pointed here is that whenever we try to identify whether a particular object we have seen or not while coming through on the road, we do not able to even recapitulate some of the attributes of it, some of the characteristics of it, because we identify an object with this characteristic only when we have a determinate perception. But in case of indeterminate perception, we cannot even speak about that object, neither we can talk about some of the attributes of that object. So, in this way Advaita Vedantas agrees with Nyayakas having the concept nirvikalpaka perception. Therefore, they mention that nirvikalpaka is uncharacterized apprehension of an individual on different objects. That means, while coming through from the home to meet your friends, you have seen many objects, it is not one object. Since many objects you have glanced through, you do not have any concrete knowledge on a particular object. If you remember, Nyaya said that it is through bhava and bhavana we identify an object or we cognize an object. Here both bhava and bhavana are missing. Therefore, the impression what we got on a particular object is not a concrete one, it is not even a valid. Further, they said that it is a conscious but not self-conscious. The nirvikalpaka perception, here the knowledge will be a conscious one but not self-conscious. It would have been self-conscious, it will turn to the determinate perception. It never remains as an indeterminate perception. It is known through inference but not in perception. Why they say a nirvikalpaka perception, whatever knowledge we get, it is known through inference, not through perception. How they say? Whenever you come through a street slowly and reach to a particular place where you met your friend asks about a particular object. There you infer the situation, because you say that when I came, that object, this may be there. Therefore, it is not your perception, it is an inferential knowledge, because you try to infer the situation whether at all you have came across to that object in particular while coming to meet your friend. Therefore, in this case the knowledge is not perceptional, though you have a glance through the object in the initial stage. However, you try to recapitulate the phenomenon that you had come across or you have glanced through. Hence, this kind of knowledge is known as nirvikalpaka perception. Here I have further written NPG stands for nirvikalpaka pratyaksa. Nirvikalpaka pratyaksa is primarily cognition of an object and its various characters without a distinct recognition of what the object exactly is. Further, I say, since recognition of the object is not definite and clear, we are unable to make a definite judgment about the object by interrelating to the diverse character of that object. This I have already explained to you. The last point, if you see that, I said we may perceive an object from a distance and indistinctly feel that it may be an arrange, but we cannot definitely say that it is an argument. Here the point is very clear. Whenever your friend asks about that particular object, you try to infer that situation and try to retrieve in your mind, saying that if at all you are faced to that object while coming to meet your friend in the way or not. So, therefore, they say that if at all you are able to recapitulate some of the information about that object on which your friend is asking, then it will be a kind of arrangement. Why it is an arrangement? Because you are not sure about that object, not even you can identify all the features about that object. Therefore, they said that if at all you can able to retrieve that particular object for which your friend is asking, then it will be an arrangement, some kind of glimpse you are given to that object while coming to meet your friend. Therefore, this knowledge will be a kind of arrangement. You cannot argue saying that whatever knowledge is a concrete knowledge, or whatever perceptual knowledge you gain while coming through all the way to meet your friends, it is a concrete knowledge or valid knowledge. In this way, they explain that how the nirvikalpaka perception is an arrangement, however, it cannot be an argument. Now, we will see what is savikalpaka pratyaksa according to Nyaya. Now, savikalpaka perception, it is a determinate perceptual cognition. In this case, our senses means 6 senses, contact to the object, and we know the object as such and such. Here such and such means we identify an object or cognize an object with such and such qualities, because without quality we all cognizer cannot identify an object with a particular name. Further, they said that, as I have discussed you now, this perceptual knowledge is a valid knowledge, because whatever knowledge we have on a particular object, it is concrete, it is very clear, it is a valid knowledge, and also all the features through which we identify an object, it conforms to that object even in the later period without any contradiction. Therefore, they said that this perception says to exist, if something exists in this world, that means to know about that object. If something exists, we can know about that object, and we know about that object means we will give a name particular that object. It is a very clear way of explaining determinate perception, because in case of determinate perception, you find that if something exists, you know that object, that means you have a knowledge about that object. And when you can say that you have a knowledge about object, because you can only say that you have a knowledge of that object only when you identify that object with some or other features. In addition to that, you give a name to that object. Therefore, they say that to exist means to know, and to know means to have a knowledge about that object, and to have a knowledge about that object means it simply says that you give a name to that object while identifying that object. Thus, they said whenever language is used, it is called savikalpaka perception. In this case, the object is determined by certain qualities and distinguished from different objects. This I have already explained to you. In this cognition, there is a definite and clear cognition of an object with its various characters, because whenever you cognize an object, you cognize with all its features, because this is the most rudiment conditions to be required to cognize an object, because any object we cognize is because of the quality. If you identify chair, you say that chair is a particular shape, particular color, and constitutes some material object, so and so forth. Therefore, it is the quality which helps us to cognize an object. So, if this is the case, then any knowledge that you gain, it is a valid knowledge, because here your perception is a determinate perception, and any knowledge you get, it satisfies asamdigdha, yathartha, and anubhava. These are the 3 basic rudiment conditions, as Nyaya said, to have a valid knowledge. Now, we will see pratyabhigyana. Pratyabhigyana in English, it is translated as recognition, recognition. That means you have cognized to an object in the past, and you encounter the same object at present, and henceforth you retrieve all the knowledge that you had in the past about that object through your memory, and impose on that object and find that whether that object will be named with so and so or not, whether it is the same object that you had experienced in the past or not. So, therefore, you find in many cases recognition is known as determinate perception. They said that all savikalpaka perception are recognition, because until unless you have a determinate perception on a particular object, the knowledge about that object never store in your soul, and whenever you experience in that object in the later period, if it is not in a sabhikalpaka perception, you cannot able to retrieve all the information as it was experienced in the past with that name. And henceforth, in this context, Nyaya said that all recognitions are determinate perception. Now, recognition means knowing a thing as that was known before to the cognizer. To recognize means to cognize the object once again as it was experienced or cognized before. Further, they say recognition consists in knowing an object not only as such and such, means as such and such qualities, but also the same object that we saw before or earlier. Thus, recognition is the conscious reference of the past and present cognition to the same object. What they said is that past and present relate to have a pratyaksa recognition. That means they are saying that there is a knowledge you had in the past and some object is presented before you and you want to identify that object with that particular name. Therefore, you make a relation to the past what you had experienced about that object and bring all the concepts with that name and impose on that object which is present before you. Therefore, you find that there is a conscious relation between the present and the past, and because of the conscious relation we are able to recognize an object with so and so name, and henceforth we say that this is a recognition. That means it is already cognized, you recognize further with the same name, and this happens only when a cognizer have a determinate perception to that object in the past. In this slide, in the last point, therefore I said in recognition we consciously bring our past cognition and relate to the present cognition, and thus all identity propositions are pratyaksa and relational. What they mean? A is identical with B, that means I can also say A is similar with B, A coincides with B. What they mean is that B and A, though we have perceived it to different time, however A and B are same. All the features of B should find in A. Now the question maybe comes to your mind, you have seen the horse in the past and now the horse you are seeing which is presented before you. So how come A and B are same? You say that the horse that you are seeing in presented before you may not be the same horse that you had seen in the past. Therefore, he is saying that A and B having the same features, so that A and B are identical because the features of the A and the features of the B both are same or both are similar. Therefore, they say that in case of pratyaksa we also need this kind of similarity concept. Then only the knowledge that we gain through the pratyaksa will be known as a valid knowledge. This is all about ordinary perception and laukika perception. Now we will be discussing extraordinary perception. Now you have all understanding on ordinary perception. Now we will be discussing what they mean by extraordinary perception. It is said that in case of extraordinary perception, the senses are not contacting the object directly, rather through some media, and if this is so, any knowledge that we gain, we can say that it is through the extraordinary perception. They said that extraordinary perceptions are of three types. One is jnana lakshana pratyaksa, another is samanya lakshana pratyaksa, and the third one is yogaja perception. Now we will be discussing in detail what they mean by samanya lakshana pratyaksa. Before that, just read my slides, you find that how they make really the difference between ordinary perception or laukika perception in one hand and another side extraordinary perception or alaukika perception. Ganges distinguishes laukika perception from alaukika perception. On his view, in ordinary perception there is a normal sense contact with object present to the senses. In case of alaukika or extraordinary perception, there is no direct contact between the sense and the object. However, the objects are conveyed through an extraordinary medium. Therefore, they said that extraordinary perception are of three kinds. As I said, you can, now I am repeating for your benefit so that you can pronounce it incorrectly: samanya lakshana pratyaksa, jnana lakshana pratyaksa, and yogaja pratyaksa. Or you say samanya lakshana perception, Jnana Lakshana perception and Yogaja perception. Now what they mean by Samanya Lakshana Pratyaksa. Now I will be discussing first. You listen to me, then we will be running through the slides. Samanya Lakshana Pratyaksa. We identify an object. Let us assume a situation. I identify an object or an animal named as cow. What they said in case of Samanya Lakshana Pratyaksa, here you find that my sense organs are contacting to the object, a particular object cow. He said that it is not limited to that. If my sense organ directly contact with that object, then it can be a Laukika perception. Then how you can say it is a Laukika perception? He said that we identify a particular object having a particular name cow because of it belongs to a universal cowness. That means whenever we identify a particular object, we also identify the universal cowness, and also we know that this particular cow belongs to that universalness of cow, and we find that the essential features which cowness represents, that these are the features we find in that animal which is presented before you. Therefore, we claim that our knowledge about that animal is a valid one, because we identify with its correct features and the object is present before us, and in addition to that we know that all the features will be conforming to the object even in the later period. In this way they said that Samanya Lakshana Pratyaksa. Samanya means it is a universal, and Lakshana means mediate, and Pratyaksa means perception. Whenever we perceive a particular object, we indirectly perceive the universalness about that object, and we know that the particular object what we are perceiving, it belongs to that universalness or a part of that universalness. In this way our sense organs never contact to that universal object directly, however it contacts through a particular object, say cow. Therefore, while contacting our sense organ to a particular object also, we can have a knowledge about this cowness. So this is called Samanya Lakshana Pratyaksa. If you see a particular table, you identify the table. Now question arises, there may be a different table. A table has 4 legs, a table have only middle legs, a table only have 2 legs, or there can be hanging tables, isn't it? Now the question arises, if table has all these features, what makes you to claim that there is an object which is presented before you having 1 legs, you are calling it a table. You say that this, I am calling that object is a table because the table belongs to the universalness of tableness, and tableness is an essential character of the table, and this particular table is part of that universalness. As a result, whenever we identify an object, we cognize an object, we cognize it because of its universal nature. When you cognize a particular animal cow, you know that there are different cows exist in this earth, and not necessarily you have to see all the cows that exist. A kind of knowledge. If you do not accept that this is a valid knowledge, then if a cow by chance having 6 legs, still you identify that animal as a cow. How it is the case? Because you know that object with such and such a name because it has some essential characteristics, and this belongs to a universal cowness, and this is all about Samanya Lakshana. Now if you see about Jnana Lakshana, what Nyaya was explaining that in case of Jnana Lakshana we had a previous experiences in the past, and in the past experience it was in a kind of very close interaction, you can say even a determinate perception that was stored in our mind. But in case of Jnana Lakshana Pratyaksa, because of that knowledge we think that there may be an object nearby. Given an example that you have a smell of sandalwood tree while walking in the street. Now earlier you had a knowledge that how sandalwood tree and the smell sandalwood are closely associated or inseparable with each other. Therefore immediately you say that I have a knowledge of object sandalwood tree. However, your sense organs is not contacting to that sandalwood tree directly. It is through the smell of sandalwood you know that there is certainly there is a tree must be here nearby, otherwise this smell never gets. Therefore you find in case of extraordinary perception the objects are not presentational in nature, what is supposed to be cognized. In case of samanya lakshana, you cognize an object because it falls under the universalness, and in case of jnana lakshana pratyakya, because of your jnana which is you have accumulated in the past, because of that your sense organs contacting to that object or to have a knowledge of an object which is not presented before you. That means where your sense organs cannot be contact to that object directly. The third one, they said that yogic perception. As you know that the person who can conquer his mind, sense organs and body can also predict about the future, because this will be possible only when you practice all yoga which we had discussed in our yoga system. When we have discussed yoga, we said that niyama, pranayama, asana, all these things one need to practice. 8 Ashtanga yoga we said, right? If in a yogi practice Ashtanga yoga, he or she can predict in the future, and whatever he predicts, the object may not be presented before him. However, he can predict the future. This is called extraordinary perception. You perceive something through your 6 sense organs, and that will be correct or valid knowledge, because you perceive because of your previous knowledge, and you achieve some kind of spirit within you by practicing yoga. Now the same thing, how Nyaya is present, will be running through the slides. Now as I said that there are 3 kinds of extraordinary perception: samanya lakshana pratyakya, jnana lakshana pratyakya, and yogaja perception. In case of samanya lakshana pratyakya, samanya stands for universal, lakshana stands for immediate, and the pratyakya stands for perception. What they said here is that the universal and particular are perceived in an extraordinary way, because the universal is not presented before you, however you cognize that universal. It is the perception of a whole class, cowness. Whole class means cowness is a universal. It is the perception of a whole class of objects through the universal property perceived in any individual members of that class. That means whenever you identify an animal cow, you find that cowness inheres in this cow. Therefore, I have said that it is the perception of whole class of objects. Whenever you perceive an object cow, you can also perceive other cows possibly exist in this earth. How can it be possible? Because of the universal property of that cow that you find in the individual cow. The last point, therefore, I said, when we perceive something as a table, we judge it as belonging to the class of tables. But to know that the thing belongs to the class of table is also to know all other tables belonging to the same class. Now continuing further, they said that if this is the case, that we know universal through the particular. We know a particular cow because we know all the cow that exist or that resides in this earth. Then we will be an omniscient being. Here they said that we cannot be an omniscient being, because a person who will be omniscient being will be knowing each and everything. What they are saying here is that to identify a particular object because of its some features, and not necessarily the same features you find in case of other animal also. However, some kind of essential feature you find in case of other animals. So therefore, it is the samanya jnana, but not by vishesha jnana we identify a particular object. Further they said, we perceive only one members of a class as an individual with its specific and universal properties, whereas other members are known as possessing the universal qualities. By explaining further, they said that like a vyapti relation, whenever you see a smoke, you find smokeness. That means seeing a smoke, there is a distant hill, there is a smoke. That means you know that wherever there is a smoke, there is a fire related or closely associated. Therefore, smokeness and fireness both are related, and as a result you say that since there is a smoke, there is a fire. So in this way, whenever you identify a particular object, there is a universalness also involved in it. Negative judgment and volition are also possible in the same way. Volition means, suppose you say that he is now getting pleasure. The pleasure has to be understood in the context of pleasureness. That means you know all over the pleasures a person can derive from any of the sources, and therefore you can be able to identify that he is now in a good mode or a pleasure mode. Therefore, the concept of pleasure can also be understood through its universalness. thus cognizing an object through its universalness is known as samanya lakshana pratyakya. In case of jnana lakshana pratyakya, I said the same thing. In this case, the cognizer sensation is based on extraordinary way to cognize the object. It is the perception of an object which is in contact with sense through a previous knowledge of itself. That means you had a past experience of knowledge and you retrieve it, therefore you cognize that object. Here the cognizer perception is based on his or her previous knowledge and association with the object. The example I have given, which I have explained to you, the fragrance of the sandalwood tree. Further, Nyaya said that in case of illusion, illusion can be a part of jnana lakshana pratyakya. An example I will give you. Suppose you have seen the water in the tank. Again, because of that previous knowledge, now you are driving in a road in the summer days. You see that there is a water in front of you, because in a long distance you are seeing. However, when you comes closer to that, you find that there is a mirage. Because of the summer day, there is a dust particles are floating. Henceforth, it looks like a water. However, this is not a water. Therefore, they say that it is in illusion also we can have a jnana lakshana pratyakya. That means when you say that this is a water prior to cognizing it, you had a knowledge about that, and that knowledge because of your jnana lakshana pratyakya. Since you have a jnana or knowledge about the water, and that knowledge you retrieve immediately by just seeing something without knowing its true nature, and henceforth you claim that there may be water in a distant place. But whenever you go to that place, your illusion now clarified. Now you realize that that is your illusion, that there is no water there, rather it is a mirage. So thus Nyaya say that jnana lakshana pratyakya is possible through our previous knowledge only. Now the last point I said, yogaja perception. I am just read out because I have already explained it. The intuitive, mystic and immediate perception of all objects both in past, present and future through the power of yogic meditation is called as yogaja perception. It is a supernatural power generated in the mind by meditation or yoga-bhasa. Yoga-bhasa means practicing all the 8 steps what yoga system prescribes. In this context, Nyaya and yoga both are speaking the same thing. Now the last point therefore I made, only the persons like yogis can have a yogic perception. No other ordinary people can have a yogic perception, because they can conquer their bodily attachment, sense organs and mind, fluctuating mind. It is the power they can gain by practicing yoga. Now I believe you have understood that how this ordinary and extraordinary perception explained by Nyaya. Now perception is over. In the next class we will be switch over to the anumana or inferential knowledge. Thank you.